back to Psychedelics Today. This is your host, Joe Moore, coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Eamon Armstrong from Life is a Festival podcast to talk about his path, personal development, and current interesting projects. There's some really interesting stuff he's up to, and I'm excited about it. And so this is the first time I talked to Eamon. I really like him. It was a really fun interview, and does he have some stories? It's cool. I will just tease you here and not really let you know what they're about yet until you dig in. I think you're going to like it, though. Some stuff we haven't really ever covered before on the show. So this episode is, we're not going to do Audible today, but we're going to talk about navigating psychedelics for clinicians and therapists. We have an 8-week program coming up on July 9, giving you solid foundations in transpersonal psychology, understanding ayahuasca, ketamine, psychedelic integration, harm reduction, and more. This program is specifically designed for clinicians and therapists who are going to be working with people who report psychedelic use. They went to Peru, had an accident at a rave or something. These clients might need support, and you can be the one to support them in their process. And this isn't anything that's illegal. This is very legal to help clients that had these experiences. And there is going to be a coming wave of people with psychedelic experiences. This is not going anywhere. It's very interesting, and the clinical trials are very promising. So we can expect a lot more people doing this. And this is our effort to help get therapists and clinicians ready for the wave that's already here and the bigger wave that's coming right behind it. So we think it's great to get ready, and you can do this at home. The program is 8 weeks long. We get together for an hour and a half once a week for 8 weeks, and there's tons of pre-recorded content, so you can kind of self-pace. And then if you miss a class because you have an appointment or something came up, you can always just catch the recording. So we record every session, so don't worry about missing a class. And we do offer certificates. We don't yet offer CEUs, but we're trying to figure that stuff out. It's a little more complicated than we imagined, but we are getting there. Yeah, so check that out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. Again, navigating psychedelics for clinicians and therapists gets started on July 9. Limited spaces are available, so sign up soon if you want to make sure you're in our class. Also available on Psychedelic Education Center is a new course on psychedelics and the shadow side of psychedelia. Kyle and Dr. Ido Cohen put that together. It features interviews with Deanna Rogers, Scott Hill, Joe Tafur, author of Fellowship of the River, Laura Mae Northrup, who runs her own podcast. She's been on the show in the past. Jessica DeRuzo, who's been on the show. Gita Vade, MD, talking about ketamine, psychotherapy in the shadow. Some really great stuff there. And this has been a very popular course. It's got an incredible amount of attention, and people seem to love it. So check it out. It's donation-based. You can check that out at psychedeliceducationcenter.com along with our other offerings. So I think that's it for this part. One more word from another sponsor, and we'll see you on the other side. This episode is brought to you by Mudwater. Mudwater is a coffee alternative with 4 medicinal mushrooms and adaptogens. With 1/7 the caffeine is a cup of coffee, you get sustainable energy without the anxiety and jitters of coffee. Kyle and I have had about 3 months worth of Mudwater, and we really like it a lot. Mudwater has really helped me slow down my coffee consumption, and I feel great after drinking it. Another thing I like about this company is that they donate a portion of each month's revenue to MAPS. Check them out at mudwater.com, mudwtr.com. Use the code psychedelic at checkout for 15% off.
All right, welcome back to Psychedelics Today, everybody. Excited to have Eamon Armstrong on, creator and host of Life is a Festival podcast. And you're also a community builder over at Maya Health, which is a new platform, which I'm excited to dig into a little bit with you on this show. I first came across your podcast a few months ago, actually. A friend sent me a link. I forget what it was. And then I stumbled across your interview with Dick Price from Esalen. And I was just like, damn.
Not Dick Price, Mike Murphy.
Oh, Michael Murphy. Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, Dick's not alive, is he?
No,
Yeah,
no.
yeah. I always get them confused. Michael
No,
Murphy. Okay, yeah.
And Mike Murphy is the father of a friend of mine, Mac Murphy. And so I had the opportunity to interview him. He had forgotten that I was showing up. And it was one of the most challenging interviews I've done and one of the interviews I'm most proud of doing. Happy to tell you about it. I don't want to launch too hard into talking about podcasting, but it was one of those moments where, as a podcaster, I was thinking, how do I crack the nut of vulnerability and connection with this man who doesn't know who I am and who is speaking about his standard Esalen conversation that he's been having for 50 years with journalists. How do I get him to give me the goods? And so I had to like crack the nut of it. It was one of those experiences where you're like, oh, okay, this is how you do it. It felt very good.
Yeah. Just an awesome episode, and hearing some of the backstory behind Esalen. I mean, Joe and I come from the Groffian background with breathwork, so that really birthed out of Esalen, and even some of the spiritual emergence stuff that really got birthed out of there. So it was just really cool to hear some of the backstory and how it got started. So that's what really turned me on to your podcast, and so I'm excited to be here with you today.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being interested, and yeah, when you start hearing about those kind of histories, these magical times in people's lives. For my show, it's Life is a Festival. And the goal of the show is not to teach you about festivals. It's to teach you how to make your life like a festival by showing these incredible lives. And it's a lot of festival culture, a lot of Burning Man, but a lot of stuff in psychedelics. So I've had Amanda Fielding on the show, who I know you just had on your show, another person who's had this incredible life spanning decades of psychedelic research and experimentation. And it's really fun to learn about these people and these things. Like, I had no idea that Hunter S. Thompson almost got thrown off the cliffs at Esalen. I didn't know that.
That was the one story that stuck out, and I was like, whoa, that's a cool story.
He was the groundskeeper there. I had no idea.
Amazing. What was something that else stuck out about that episode? I mean, I think from our background, just talking about Esalen, I mean, for those that might not know about Esalen, do you think you could give a little background about that? Because I mean, it is kind of in our lineage, and so it might be interesting for folks to learn a little bit about that.
Totally, yeah. So Esalen was the seat of the human potential movement, and it's a beautiful property on the Central California coast near Monterey and Carmel, in a place called Big Sur, with these really breathtaking cliffs, and then also these natural hot springs. And Esalen was a family property that was turned into this retreat center, kind of school, kind of gathering of all these luminaries in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then beyond, of course. So as you mentioned, Stanislav Grof was teaching there. I'm not sure if he was a resident or if he just came by to teach, but it's a veritable who's who of the psychedelic and human potential movement around that time. So Aldous Huxley's theories were part of the founding of the school. Hunter S. Thompson was the groundskeeper, which is hilarious. Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, everybody that you can think of from that period went through Esalen. And Esalen is, of course, still cooking today and still hosting really incredible seminars and retreats. My yoga teacher, Janet Stone, does something there. So it's all of these different kinds of human potential expressions through body, breath work, through psychedelics. Although they were not publicly a pro-psychedelic space, there was a lot of psychedelic leaders who moved through the space at that time. And what I was alluding to earlier about it being a difficult but ultimately successful podcast for me was that I had met Mike Murphy briefly at Burning Man. He was there for like an afternoon with Chip Conley, who's a mentor of mine. And he didn't really know me. And so when we did the podcast, he started into talking about Esalen in the way that he often does with journalists, not really knowing who I was. And it took about 20 minutes for me to properly express that not only did I know who he was, what it was, but I'd actually read his writing, and I was familiar with this concept of evolutionary panentheism, which is the idea that God is indwelling and is expressed through evolution in a couple of different levels. So the evolution of the cosmos, the evolution of the species, or our own personal evolution. And so I kind of like it. It was while the beginning of the podcast, I was like, this podcast is not going very well. I'm not getting real vulnerability. I'm not getting funny stories. I'm getting the same thing that any sort of journalist would get from this, 89-year-old man who's been talking about this place for so many years. So how do I get in the pocket with him? And I did that by reframing his idea of evolutionary panentheism into my own words. And then he had this moment of like, oh, he gets it. And then we got to have a conversation. And I stopped being a journalist and started being like a member of his community, a member of the people who are part of this movement that he's so passionate about. And it was really hard to do that. And in that moment, when it clicked, you know, I'm sure you all get this when you're like doing a podcast and you're like, oh shit, I got in the pocket. Like, I don't even have to work anymore. Now the conversation will flow effortlessly. And it did, you know, and he told all these hilarious stories and talked about taking acid and all these sorts of things that I never thought he would, you know, get on my podcast to talk about. And so for me as a podcaster, that kind of like sitting in the pocket of vulnerability by really earning the trust of the person I'm having a conversation with is kind of core to what I've been trying to do with Life as a Festival. Because shared vulnerability, I think, is the best way of transmitting ideas. When you hear someone's lived experience in a way that really resonates with you, with your whole being, you can completely receive their thinking and ideas. Whereas if it's just kind of on the surface in an intellectual way, you don't necessarily grok it to the same degree, at least in my experience.
Totally. So I guess let's dig in a little bit about your history in the festival culture, and then we'll talk about how you're starting to transition into community building within the mental health space with psychedelics. So can you give the listeners a little bit of background about your festival history and how you got involved in that space? And
Sure. Well, let's just start at the end real quick, and then we'll go to the beginning. Cool. And the end being that I'm very passionate about mental wellness. I really believe that those things inside us that we're most ashamed of, that causes so many problems, the problem solving we're constantly doing inside us, that's actually a doorway to human blossoming in a way that is full of fabulous adventure. And my journey of understanding that in myself and then wanting to support others in it actually took a current through the festival world. So the fact that I'm interested in supporting mental wellness and spiritual blossoming through psychedelics now is very much giving to others what was the kind of difficult fertilizer of my starting place. So I was really depressed and I was living in Oakland and I'd graduated college. And I remember after graduating college, I was like, well, how do you meet anyone anymore? Like, where's community now? I remember feeling this incredible loss. And it's not like I even loved college that much. There's a lot that was, you know, I was in a fraternity. I had no idea who I was. I don't know if anyone listening has had that experience of being in a fraternity, but it's a peculiar place. And I didn't know where to find community or where to connect with people. And I moved to San Francisco and I started a funky dance band called I Can Dress Myself. And we played psychedelic children's music for adults, but like kind of like little talking heads, little silly, wild stuff. And we threw these mushroom tea parties on Haight Street. And for about 4 years, I was throwing these mushroom tea parties with my friends and throwing these events. And of course, that took us to Burning Man, because if you're making electronic music, you got to go to Burning Man. I didn't know what Burning Man was. I went to Burning Man 10 years ago, and we threw a camp. We built a live music camp. I remember the first year we went, we built a stage out of wood, which was a really bad decision, like big chunks of wood that we had. It was difficult. I'm going to slow down for a second.
Deep breath.
Right? You know, that's the thing about telling a story is you can kind of start getting away with the narrative. And I want to make sure that I'm connecting to it and connecting to your question. Community has always been important to me. And I Can Dress Myself was the first time that I was able to really build community around a creative project. So everyone who came to our shows became part of our crew and community. And artists got to make music videos and make sets and make costumes. And I learned a lot about the value of self-expression for leadership and for community building, and the fabulousness of costumes and dressing up and creating these otherworldly environments. And then, of course, taking psychedelic mushrooms as a group. And the key to throwing a mushroom tea party, would you like to know the key to throwing a mushroom tea party?
Love to hear it.
Okay, the key to throwing a mushroom tea party is have people drink less mushrooms than they think that they're drinking. So you measure, what we always did is we'd measure it so that people were drinking about a third of what they assumed that they were drinking. And we never had a single incident. We never had a single, and this is before I knew about the Zendo project and psychedelic peer support, but we never had any, because everyone just thought they were tripping harder than they were. And so everyone could kind of be in a similar space on the same wavelength. And then the people who were really more advanced psychonauts would be aware of what was going on in their bodies and be able to dose themselves a little bit higher if they wanted to. And for those who are just oh, mushroom tea, that sounds cool, they drink a cup, think that they'd had a lot, and actually didn't have that much. So I went to Burning Man. I started volunteering with the Burning Man special events team, which throws the Decompression Street Fair and different off-playa Burning Man events, and started doing social media management for them. So I was using social media to get people to go to these I Can Dress Myself shows, started using social media to get people to go to Burning Man's off-playa events. Then I started doing big social media marketing campaigns for street fairs and annual events, stuff like How Weird Street Fair or Sea of Dreams, these big San Francisco events. And from there, I was invited to apply to be on the founding team of a website called Fest 300. And Fest 300 was founded by Chip Conley, who's I think he was the head of the board of Burning Man, but he's on the board of Burning Man. Esalen was, doing global strategy for Airbnb, one of these folks who's just really everywhere. And he launched a website called Fest 300, which is a guide to the world's 300 best festivals. And I started as a community manager when I first started in 2013. And then over time, I ended up becoming the creative director and the public face of the company. And so I was doing global community building in the festival world. And in that capacity, I got to go all over the world to all of these incredible festivals and meet all of these really interesting people, which has been the foundation of Life as a Festival. I can then interview all these people I met, and psychedelics, and especially the harm reduction approach to psychedelics and substances generally at festivals became really core to our editorial voice. And so I was meeting people through the Zendo project, doing psychedelic peer support. I went to Boom Festival in Portugal. I met the people who were doing Cosmic Hair there. I wrote a number of articles around psychedelic peer support and harm reduction in the festival world. So the psychedelic space was very much in that for me. And around that same time, I started getting deeper into psychedelic work myself, particularly with medicine work, ayahuasca ceremonies, that sort of thing. And then when Fest 300 was ultimately sold to another company, I left the company and then I went and did a little, tour around the world having strange experiences, Vipassana, became a yin yoga teacher, and I did Iboga with the Bwiti in Gabon. And then I came back to San Francisco and I started Life as a Festival, which I've been doing for a year and a half now. So that's a somewhat succinct history of my festival adventures.
That's substantial. When you were with the Bwiti, was that when you got initiated? Or
yeah,
okay.
So I had attempted to do Iboga twice before that. And they're kind of funny stories about why both of them didn't work. But I eventually made it to Libreville with, I sat with Atum's lineage. And if you're familiar with the Iboga world, Atum is an 89-year-old, he was 89 at the time, maybe? He's around at late 80s, former police officer who became a Iboga shaman and built a whole temple in the outskirts of Libreville that is very well regarded internationally. And he's represented Iboga at international psychedelic conferences, even though he's a very old man. And his community is the place where a lot of Westerners ultimately end up doing Iboga, because it's near Libreville, it's in the outskirts of Libreville. And even though everybody speaks French, except for his son, Simon, and another man, Joe, who picked me up from the airport, it's a more accessible way of doing a traditional Iboga initiation than some deeper in the Congo Basin.
Mm. That's really interesting. We haven't really touched the Bwiti religion much on the show. Like, we've had Dimitri Mujanis on, we've had a few other initiates, but we don't necessarily get super into it. And it's kind of it's a strange thing, because seems to be a really welcoming religion to outsiders. even though it's kind of a I don't know, tough experience. I don't know if we want to jump into Iboga right now deeply, but we're already here, so maybe we can.
Well, it's however you want to pace out the show.
Cool.
I'm happy to get very deep on Iboga. I know that that's something that the listeners would be very interested in because it is, I think, the most exotic feeling of the psychedelics at this time. Maybe that and 5-MeO, although 5-MeO does seem to be even more widespread than Iboga. But I'm happy to talk about Iboga and Bwiti and what I learned about that experience. So yeah.
let's dig in. Like, how do you like to discuss the topic and the religion? It's a psychedelic plant, but there's also a big religion around it that's been around for quite a long time.
So first of all, the way that I like to discuss Bwiti is carefully. There are a lot of, as with any good initiation, secrecy is an important part of creating the container for initiation. If you knew what was going to happen, you wouldn't have that liminal experience where time turns upside down. I mean, you still have that through the psychedelic, but the Bwiti experience is much more than just Iboga. The Iboga is an aspect of it, but I was in the temple space for 10 days. So there was many, many, many rituals. I definitely spent a lot of time being told what to do in French, and I don't speak French. And I made a bunch of really amateur mistakes. Like I ran out of food at one point. I just literally ran out of food, expecting that someone would help me. And that's not how it works there. It's not like a cushy Costa Rica Iboga retreat with like fresh papaya being brought to you in the morning. It is the opposite of that. It is very, very different than that. But like any really profound initiation, it's really important that you don't talk about certain aspects of the initiation. And I used to do a little more. I used to tease a little more when I talked about it because there's one thing that I did that was like wild and crazy, but I can't say what it is. So I used to be a little more like I'd tease that a little bit more. I'm actually, I guess I'm doing that curious in this moment. But there are just certain, I know, right? Well, the thing is if you want to know about Bwiti, you can do that research. You can kind of find out about what those initiations involve. But suffice it to say, it's a completely different cultural context, and a lot of it has to do with cleansing. And there are some very specific ritualistic cleansings that you do as part of your initiation. So the initiation with Atum's group, there are 3 different chambers that you may be assigned to. And when you first arrive, first of all, they do a reading to decide whether you can even come, and they turn a lot of people away. So first they decide whether or not you can come, and when you're allowed to come, you come. There's some cosmic stuff with that too. I tried to go to Gabon and I didn't have the right visa, and I was detained and then expelled, which was very, it wasn't the right, it wasn't the right time. I did it wrong and I had to come back and do it again. But so they decide that you're able to come, and then they choose, or it's a astrological reading, or it's a council reading. There's some sort of cosmic checking in that they do about what is right for you. And with Atum's lineage, they have 3 chambers, and the chamber that I was assigned was Mumbayano, the Mumbayano chamber. And there's 2 others, and they'd actually like me to come back and do a second chamber at some point. So we'll see. And so,
what do you mean by chamber? Like, is this a hut of some sort? I don't know if you're allowed to describe it, but I'm just trying to.
Yeah. So I can't tell you what was inside the chamber, and forgive me, dear listener, for being, opaque in this, but it is just sort of the way that it's important for me to do it. The chamber is a building with no windows. There's a bathroom, there's a little kitchen, there's a big room, and then there's like a shower area. No, not really a shower, like a bathing room, but no running water, like a room with a drain. And then in the main room, that's where, well, see, even that, I feel like it's a little too much.
No worries, yeah.
It's a room, it's a building you don't leave. And I was in the chamber for 5 days. And so that was before taking the Iboga. Well, there's some rituals in the very beginning when you get there. Let me pause again. I don't know if you've noticed this in yourself, but sometimes it's difficult for me to fully drop into my heart and into the authenticity of a really profound peak experience that I've told the story of here and there. So I want to tell you all the details, but I want to make sure that it's coming deeply from my heart. And it's tricky because I'm dancing around what I think it's okay to say and not say in this moment, while also wanting to be fully connected and slow down and not just sort of like rambling off a series of details about it. So I'm going to try to take it a little slower,
Yeah, no worries.
if you don't mind. Would you mind just kind of directing me again in terms of what you're interested in about the Bwiti initiation? Kind of get me going again.
Well, it's obviously a mystery religion, similar to a lot of, things like Masonry, Eleusinian mysteries, all sorts of other traditions that involve secrecy and rituals. So, that's important to know. I actually, for some reason, didn't know that. I've not looked into Iboga. It's not really my forte. So it's really interesting to hear that. It was just more like you're wanting to understand your experience and a little bit more about the Bwiti religion and to whatever degree that's helpful for people or for you, or even interesting. I'm sure you've said some things over and over again that are not interesting to you anymore, but really wherever you want to go with that.
Thank you. Well, and thanks for having some patience with me as I kind of land a little more into my heart. I often feel that the first 20 minutes of a podcast are still kind of warm up as you kind of get the vibe.
Totally.
Especially remotely.
Yeah.
I went to Gabon because I wanted a sledgehammer psychedelic experience. I've been kind of fumbling around with confusion around sexuality and having a fully surrendered, expressed experience. It is extremely difficult for me to surrender. And where I see that play out most is in my sexual life, in my experience of trust and intimacy. Intimacy is extraordinarily difficult for me. And so I had approached this in different ways over time. I'd seen different therapists. I'd done a number of ayahuasca ceremonies and found that I'd gotten a lot of insight with ayahuasca. But the reason that I chose Iboga and the reason that I chose to do Iboga in Gabon is because I was taught that Iboga is the most powerful antidote for addiction. And I felt that I had some kind of addictive aspects that were underpinning my frustrations around intimacy. And that was addiction to pornography a lot earlier and addiction to erotic fiction. So I was very much captivated by fantasy and story. And then when it came to actual sexual experiences, was kind of frozen. And I just could not figure out why that was. And I couldn't access it. So that's what brought me to Gabon to do Iboga. And what I was taught about Iboga is that Iboga doesn't actually remove your addictions in the way you might imagine. That really what an addiction is a pattern in response to some kind of trauma. And that pattern, and again, I'm not a psychiatrist. This is my understanding from a lot of conversations, but that trauma pattern can be amplified by a sort of epigenetic predisposition towards certain mental health conditions. That makes a lot of sense to me. But ultimately, these addictive patterns are actually avoiding trauma in ways that it's like the limp that stays with you once your leg is physically healed, that sort of thing. And so what Iboga does is it goes to the root of that trauma and shows you the very core space where this addictive sort of patterning and cycling is coming from. So that's why I went to do Iboga with the Bwiti. And as you pointed out, it is a mystery tradition. It has a really long integration period. It takes a long time to make sense of what happened. And my experience with ayahuasca has been cosmic, sweepingly beautiful, and in a certain sense, kind of incremental. Like whenever I go to an ayahuasca ceremony, I take my medicine and I take the next step. Whereas Iboga took me farther than I could understand. And I'm still in the process of, sorting out these pieces that emerged psychologically for me during that experience.
Interesting. I don't know if you can describe that. Like, what do you mean by taking you farther than you can understand versus like ayahuasca? Can you give a little bit more context there?
Yeah, of course. So for me, ayahuasca is very narrative, and it follows a really, for me, a really predictable arc in that there's a resistance, then there's a certain release, whether that's a purgative release or just letting go of a certain way of thinking. And then there's a gentle landing with a lot of gratitude and love and connection. And I feel like every time, and I've sat with ayahuasca 24 times, every time I've sat with it, I feel that I take another step. And it can be very painful, very challenging, but all the while I feel like something is holding my hand. And that may be the serotogenetic effect of the MAO inhibitor. It may be the presence of a kind of reciprocal intelligence that is Mama Ayahuasca. But whatever it is, I feel like I'm given just as much as I can take for that next step. With Iboga, first of all, it was a 48-hour psychedelic ritual at the end of like 7 days or I'm not sure how long it had been at that time, maybe 9 days in this village, in this temple, then in this chamber for 5 days, and then having a 48-hour Iboga experience. So it's arduous and long. So Iboga is a root bark, and the way that I ingested it in the ritual was as a sort of brambly spool that moved through my system really slowly and very painfully. I felt it move through my entire system. And concurrently, I felt from the top of my head moving downward, it's a very strange experience because, as you know, if you've taken psychedelics, there's a certain ineffable quality to the psychedelic experience that is actually part of why it's so profound, in that it doesn't map onto language. And so then when you try to talk to someone about it, you're like, oh, these sweeping vistas and dimensions folding in on themselves. And you're like, yeah, it sounds like gobbledygook. But if you were there trying to filter that into language, of course, that's how you'd want to say it. And I think there's certain people who've done a great job, Michael Pollan, Terence McKenna. There's people who've written about psychedelics, but it's all metaphor and approximation ultimately. So for me, as I think about it now, a year and a half after doing it, I have this vision of this ancient, meticulous doctor doing some kind of like Tetris kind of thing, filtering from the top of my head down through my body, where it was sort of moving through on a cellular level. And as I understood it, finding little pieces of memory or trauma or disjointed aspects of being and doing these little chiropractic adjustments and sort of popping them open and showing me a memory or showing me something from my past. And I've had a lot of congestion energetically in what you would call a third chakra area. I don't really know what it is. I don't necessarily ascribe to any kind of spiritual perspective, but it's around that solar plexus, Manipura sort of place. And as the Iboga moved through my body, when it hit that space, I felt like it was like blasting through tunnels. And the visions were pretty detailed, tons of pieces of memory. And I just felt very blasted open. And I felt it move all the way through me and really it really did reveal kind of what was at the core of what was causing me so much dysfunction in terms of intimacy. Like, it showed me exactly what it was. It didn't solve it for me. Like, I'm still working with what was revealed in that experience, but it took me through all the layers of, when you have a trauma, you build, especially a childhood trauma, psychologically, you build these different layers of protection around it, these different kinds of compensations, almost like sub-personalities that protect you from having to feel that pain again. Because when you're a child and you experience trauma, especially inescapable trauma, there's a sense of annihilation. You will be annihilated unless you develop structures to distance yourself from that pain. This is fundamental in trauma, and especially childhood trauma. And so what Iboga did for me, I felt like Iboga was like blasting a train through a mountainside of like all of my protective layers. And there's this moment in the ceremony. So there's so many moments. It's like ridiculously intricate pageantry. at the climax of the ceremony, the entire community was there in the most exquisite costumes, like blow Burning Man away type costumes in Gabon. Because spiritually in the Bwiti tradition, when you, I want to say so much that I'm not allowed to say. Okay. There is something in the Bwiti tradition around a certain kind of costume, a certain kind of outfit that represents your truest self. And when you go through these various initiations, you are given this costume. And so this community was all in these beautiful costumes. And in a climactic moment of the ritual, I was surrounded by a group of very large men in a circle, and the circle was kind of closing in on me. And everyone who was doing the initiation had gone through this moment. And in this moment of these men kind of closing in on me, I suddenly had this profound sense of fighting them. And I've never had that. I've never had the energy of fighting someone in my whole life. I've never had that access to that kind of anger. And suddenly, and again, at the tail end of 48 hours of Iboga. So, and not eating very much food and in a very like frantic state, I'm in this circle of men closing in, and I just started fighting everybody, like just pulling like huge African dudes off of my body and like crying and suddenly I was able to tap in to this anger that lived deep in my body, deep in my pelvis. I've had this incredible anger that got to finally come out in that moment. Yeah. So I've been working with that for the past 18 months. Is what Iboga managed to do. And it's funny, actually, every time I talk about it, if I can get into a place of authenticity where I'm really connected to it, I actually do learn more. And so in this moment, thinking back to that experience of like feeling these men closing in on me and feeling this incredible anger and self-preservation able to emerge. And I wasn't like punching people, but I was like pulling and pushing these men and like pulling them off of me and feeling the full strength of not being able to be contained. It was extremely profound. And that wasn't a vision. That was a physical thing that actually happened towards the end of a very visionary experience.
And was that like the first time you were able to kind of tap into that power? As is that something like you put away and were able to tap back into?
Yeah, and I mean the short context here is that I had an angry dad. I had an angry alcoholic dad. And what's beautiful in the Iboga story, how the Iboga story culminates in my conversation with him. So my father's now been sober for, how old am I? I'm 38. So he's been sober for 30 years. And we're good friends. But when I was a little boy, he was an alcoholic, and I just had a very difficult childhood with him. And I could never be angry. Like I could never be angry because my dad would be angrier. And then I couldn't be angry because I was growing up in a society where masculine anger is dangerous. You cannot, there's a whole thing around being a good man and not being angry and not fighting and not. So this Iboga experience was the first time that I got to tap into that anger and feel it, and feel that anger actually in service of your appropriate and righteous boundaries is a positive, powerful medicine. Anger is the portal to the warrior archetype in the mythopoetic men's concept. Are you familiar with men's work? Do you know the mythopoetic men's movement?
Talking like Iron John and beyond.
Yeah, Iron John. So there's a book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, and it talks about mature masculine archetypes, the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. And the warrior is the fighting for what you believe in. The warrior is holding boundaries and being assertive. And the access point to the warrior is anger. So you need to own your anger and be able to embody it and feel it, and then use it to the service of your highest purpose to activate the warrior archetype in yourself. And for many people, I think a lot of people like myself grew up feeling that anger was wrong. And I can speak primarily to the male experience in terms of anger. I know that women have a comparable experience. And of course, there's all sorts of a litany of different types of gender and sexuality experiences growing up. But for me, accessing that anger, like I had so many barriers to how incredibly angry I was. And the Iboga took me to the center of that anger and let it be real for the first time. And when I say Iboga has a long integration period, I'm still integrating that anger. I'm still understanding I'm in a loving partnership with a really incredible woman, and I get so angry at her. I get so angry, and it's not her fault, and it's not fair to her. So, I'm not like a crazy, aggressive, angry person. I just get very I feel like a child because it's accessing a child part of me when I have that experience of anger. But I'm continuing now to, working with a trauma therapist and kind of like working through some of this stuff. But the point of it all is that my defenses were so robust to hide that part of myself, to exile that part of myself, that I needed the sledgehammer of Iboga to take me to the core of that anger and allow it to be real, because I had built so much of my identity and personality on that I am not angry and I will never be angry because anger is dangerous.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that and being really open about your process. It's just really helpful to hear, and just the vulnerability. But, something else that comes up too, you're talking about Iboga being the sledgehammer, but I'm also wondering too about this kind of rites of passage. I mean, it sounds like the community's getting together. There might be some narrative, people dressed up, or, men coming together. And when I think about like psychedelic rites, I mean, I don't know. I've never been down to Peru, but just this idea of like a rites of passage. And I don't know, could you speak any more about that to whatever you can? Because it sounds like there is other parts of this initiation that we don't really see, I guess, in like other psychedelic ceremonies, right? Like there is some sort of narrative that's playing out, or maybe, people coming together, the community coming together to help you through this process.
Well, so I was actually studying male rites of passage, specifically in the context of my trip to Gabon. So I was in Australia with a guy named Ian McKenzie, who has a beautiful podcast called The Mythic Masculine. And he's been one of my mentors and colleagues in men's work. And we were actually doing a speaking tour about masculinity in Australia. My dad's actually Australian too. So that was a really interesting thing to be in Australia talking about masculinity. And we met with a guy named Arnie Rubenstein, who is doing rites of passage for young Australian teenagers. And so we were in this conversation about rites of passage prior to me going to Gabon. So I was actually experiencing the initiation through the lens of the lack of initiation in modern Western culture, particularly, I think, for young men. And there's a quote, there's an African proverb that says something along the lines of, if you do not initiate a young man, he will burn down the village just to feel the heat. I'm not sure if I'm not sure if that's the exact phrase of this, but so basically the idea of rites of passage is that when a young man crosses that threshold into adulthood, he has to experience a liminal space of transformation where he is willing to let certain childish aspects of himself fall away. And I've been caring about this and studying this and paying attention to this for a long time. And I think that we have in our modern Western culture a lot of lost young people, a lot of protracted adolescence. I live in San Francisco, and I don't have any friends here at this time who live in San Francisco and have children. There's a lot of this being in this sort of like not quite grown up space. And the value of a rite of passage is that you're confronted with certain things that you can't really get to it on your own. The feeling that you very well may die is a really profound initiatory experience. Iboga is a potentially lethal psychedelic. I was in Libreville in Gabon with only people who speak French and someone who spoke English who was there every once in a while. No doctors, no heart monitors. I ran out of food. I could have died there. So the fact that you can die is actually part of the initiatory experience. The fact that the community comes together to help you cross the threshold is part of this initiatory experience. And so I was really going to Gabon with this vision of my own step into a kind of maturation and trying to shed some sort of childish limitations by virtue of that experience. Now, specifically to your question about the Bwiti and initiation, I was in the chamber with 5 other people, all Gabonese, 4 young men and 1 woman who was a little older. And I'm not sure exactly where it stands in terms of what that initiation is for at different times in people's lives. I know that there are children who are initiated into the Bwiti religion. I think it's less a rite of passage in this traditional masculine rite of passage kind of way, and more an initiation into the religion itself, and an initiation into a very spiritual way of experiencing the world, less so than this kind of like, after you do this, now you are a man.
Right.
I kind of used it that way for myself, but it's more an initiation into the religion than a maturation threshold per se.
Yeah, that makes sense. And on the topic of rites of passages, I'm curious, since you spent a lot of time in the festival world, and I guess this is kind of going a little bit off topic from Iboga, but like, do you see, because I've always kind of viewed like, since we don't have rites in the Western parts, like we're kind of like trying to recreate it. And I see something like Burning Man, some of these festivals as a way to kind of recreate that. You have, this community aspect, you're kind of in a liminal time. There might be substances involved for some people, but and then I always think like we don't always have like that integration or what are we getting like initiated into? And then we repeat it over and over and over again to try to recreate this experience.
I think part of the feeling of going to Burning Man as coming home represents a lack of a feeling of home in our own lives, and the need to belong to the Burning Man community as a foremost identity is a response to the atomization of our society and the sense of a lack of tribe. But ultimately, Burning Man isn't a rite of passage. It isn't designed as a rite of passage. So while it can be used as a rite of passage and has certain features to it, it doesn't have some key aspects that are really important, which is, in a traditional rite of passage, a young man is brought through an experience that is designed explicitly to show him that he is now a responsible adult that has the obligations to the community, and also show the community that there are new expectations of this young man. So it's an experience design with an end point. Burning Man is a temporary experiment in civic living. It's this otherworldly place we go to experiment with art and community, but it doesn't have, first of all, it isn't orchestrated by elders in a really explicit cultural way. There are certainly people who are elders in the Burning Man community who are helping the newbies through the experience. It certainly is a liminal experience. It certainly is a threshold experience in many people's lives, but you don't have a community it doesn't initiate you into a community. I mean, there's the Burning Man community certainly, but it doesn't really, when Burning Man's over, you go back to your life. And I think that may be part of why people spend a couple of weeks sort of, that was the greatest experience. I'm trying to hold on to it, but it's starting to recede. And then want to create communities in their lives. I think people do a great job of creating communities on the Burning Man platform, but it doesn't function as a traditional rite of passage because we're not living in a village structure any longer. And so there isn't the stewardship of the elders. And for that reason, Burning Man can go all sorts of ways. You can show up at Burning Man and really damage your psyche through your choices there. That can completely happen in that space. You're not held in the same way that you would be held in a rite of passage.
Yeah, definitely. I guess I didn't mean to say that Burning Man is a rite of passage, but just culturally how, since we don't have any sort of rites, it's like we're trying to, find our own at times, right? Like I always think about like what type of rites do we have? Maybe drinking, going to college, having sex. Not really much out there for Western culture. Joining a gang. Yeah, drive-bys. Joining a gang. So yeah, it's just, I don't know. I always love exploring the topic of rites of passages. I think it's fascinating. And just, I guess I didn't realize, this experience with the Bwiti seem more of kind of like a rites of passage. And I think that's kind of cool. I feel like we don't really hear about that too much within these psychedelic cultures. I mean, I guess to some extent, like I guess you could get initiated, but it just sounds like, there's kind of more of a narrative in this experience that you had.
Well, and let me just say at this point on the record, I absolutely intend to eat mushrooms with my children as a threshold experience, and design a rite of passage that involves a psychedelic experience that I share with them. And I'm sure 20 years from now, or whenever I have a child at the threshold of adulthood, everybody will be doing mushrooms anyway. I mean, it's, there's no way it's not seeding into the mainstream. But I think that part of why psychedelics are so valuable in terms of a rite of passage is because they are in and of themselves a liminal space. There's a temporal distortion that will happen with any psychedelic. I mean, even an entheogen has a certain kind of way of extending time. But by entheogen, I'm meaning more specifically like an MDMA. I don't know if that distinction is clear. But psychedelics are liminal spaces. They are the upside down time. And so if you want to accelerate certain kinds of growth, the psychedelic space is a great place in which to do that. And if the type of growth that you're hoping to accelerate is a kind of rite of passage, and you can create the container around that, both within the psychedelic experience and in relation to the broader community, I think they're profound tools for that and have been used for a long time in that way. And, in the Bwiti, there is that element as well.
Celebrity Dax Shepard became really public that he's going to eat psychedelics with his children. Thought that was pretty interesting. And that's a theme that's coming up a lot more lately. People are willing to be more public about that and, give some power to that idea. Was it Mark Hayden, the head of MAPS Canada, was really grilled on this topic somewhat recently. When is old enough? And he would say maturity, when they're mature. And he didn't really want to give a number. I think eventually he was grilled so hard that he said 12 years old, like whenever maturity really set in, right? Whatever that really means. But not that long ago, people at 12 years old were having families and businesses and whatnot.
It all depends on the culture. In traditional shamanic cultures, children drink medicine, because it's part of the landscape. It's part of the texture and fabric of people's lives. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what the world will be like. I don't know when I'm having kids. It's a very strange time to think about a longer term future. But I do want my children to have their first psychedelic experience in a place of as total safety as possible. Because I think that the safety piece of the psychedelic experience is fundamental, which is why the Zendo project is so important. I'm sure you both are all hip to the Zendo project and psychedelic peer support.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of my access point into having a service relationship to psychedelics is through the Zendo project. I was embedded with them as a journalist with Fest 300 at Envision Festival in Costa Rica in 2015. And people, the Zendo 10 is creating a safe set and setting for people who are having difficult psychedelic experiences to land and to process whatever has come up. And there's a general belief among psychonauts and people in the psychedelic community, there's a sort of broad belief that a difficult psychedelic experience is not a bad thing and can actually be a very good thing, because what is difficult about the experience is not some negative drug thing happening to you. It's actually releasing and opening up something that's inside you that needs to be moved out. And so the Zendo project is an opportunity when people have taken psychedelics to party to then, if they then have this difficult experience, to provide a safe space for them to process that through. And with the people that I've sat with at the Zendo, I mean, pretty much across the board, people have had breakthrough experiences in the context of their difficult psychedelic experiences.
Having a safe space can... Yeah.
Difficult does not mean bad.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's, my ayahuasca experience was quite terrifying, and it was very helpful. There's just a lot of framework you can put around
When did you do ayahuasca?
2009 maybe. And it was actually my first psychedelic experience outside of holotropic breathwork, which is really interesting. I think I was trying to grow mushrooms at the time and they didn't work for me, or I didn't have the balls to go for it. So I actually found like a really good ayahuasca group, loose framing, but I like them. I would probably go back, but it's been very helpful for sure. It was very, 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 very helpful for at least a year.
And have you did you only do the one?
I've only had ayahuasca once. Yeah.
Not compelled to go back.
There needs to be space for it, right? Like I fell back on this Terrence McKenna story he told at one point, like the time to eat the psychedelic is before you start building the house, not halfway through. So I need a little bit more time to build the house before I want to go super deep again. I certainly use psychedelics and drugs, with some frequency now, but not necessarily in that capacity. There can be this dysregulating thing that could knock you off the rails a little bit, though it could be course correcting. It could be quite disruptive, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it does. It's interesting for me personally. There's an art to surrendering to psychedelics. And one of my favorite parts of the experience of doing really powerful shamanic medicines is how deeply can I surrender and trust this experience, no matter how frightening it gets. And I think that for me, it's kind of a contrast to some of the challenges where I feel limited in the outside world, where I feel like I'm limited by fear, or I'm limited by my own stories, or my, in the beginning of the show, talking about issues with intimacy. But there's something about the psychedelic space, and I find it a lot actually with ketamine, that it's a type of surfing where you need to like lean into allowing and accepting, and you can kind of get in the pocket if you surrender. And then something comes up and you're afraid, and then it's like, okay, how powerfully can I meet this with my own softness and my own surrender? And how can I dissolve these jagged edges in the limitation of my psyche and then see what's beyond them? And I love it. It's such an adventure to do that. And I sometimes think that, I'm not sure where y'all stand philosophically on why we're all here and what it all means, but I tend to believe that everything is all kind of conspiring for a certain experience that we can't understand. It's almost like life itself is like an initiation. We're in a space where we must respond to what is surrounding us. And so the trauma, the shame, the pain, the anger, all these things that when we're little are so negative and we want to push away, they become, as Ram Dass would say, grist for the mill of the awakening. They're all just different things that we can press against or surrender to or work with. And from that perspective, I don't regret, or, I'm not unhappy that I have my particular bag of trauma and limitations. I think they create texture for this ride and give me something to work with, which I feel very grateful for.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah, I will say that I'll go back to holotropic breathwork pretty regularly.
Yeah.
That's kind of my main medicine. But, recreational fun times with friends and connecting at a deeper level is also really transcendent and helpful for me as well. But yeah, so many paths.
Do you get the claws when you do breath work?
Yeah. Carpopedal muscle spasms or tetany. Yeah. It's most people get it, I think.
I did.
It's an interesting response.
I think I've only had it once or twice.
I kind of like it.
I used to get it so hardcore. I kind of like it until it's super painful. It'll eventually go away, usually like within a half hour, but that can be a pretty extreme sensation for a lot of folks.
My challenge with breath work, and I haven't done a ton of it. I did some shamanic breath work training in Bali, but my problem with breath work is that my ego is so strong and so desiring to control a peak experience that with breath work, I feel like I'm forcing it. I'm like, give me the drugs, man. Like I'm like chasing the high in the breathing. Like I'm orienting my psyche in the hopes of some sort of a transformative kind of psyche shattering experience. So I'm like gripping that and actually then having the opposite experience. And maybe I haven't done enough of it, but I just find that because it's a tool that I'm using to take myself to a shamanic place, my ego hijacks my ability to have any kind of surrendered experience. And then I'm just like gripping and forcing and like I'm trying to get there. Do you have any issue with that in breath work?
I was just reading about this in Carl Jung's, I think, Modern Man in Search of Soul. And it talked about that ego reaction and response to, catharsis type work. I would say you should try breath work with us and we can give you some more feedback, but it might be a few months before we can do that.
I was going to say, can we do that remotely? Or
I wish. We're not necessarily there yet with comfort level with remote. We're kind of like a hands-on organization and method. Yeah, it's, the body can react. I don't know anything about that breathwork method, so I can't really comment on it. But ours is like a 3-hour session, really heavy breathing, more volume of air than normal, circular breaths, no pause at the top and bottom, and really loud, intense music. Sometimes paired with body work. Like perhaps at the end of 3 hours, you didn't have much of an experience, but we do a little bit of body work, and then it could just unfold because like everything's been layered, like right here or something. We just like press on it with you, and it could just blow right up. For a lot of people, nothing happens, and then we do some body work, and then they see the face of God. I won't say a lot of people. Some people have that type of thing happen.
Is breath work often paired with psychedelics, or is it a different path to get to the same place? And so
different path.
It doesn't really.
I like to think of them as the same.
Yeah, but you wouldn't put them together to accelerate it or amplify it.
I don't think there's a need to do that.
The way I view it is like breath is a vehicle, just as a psychedelic is a vehicle. And when people ask me this pretty often, I always think about you can use your breath to then navigate the psychedelic experience. These are all vehicles to get to a state or an experience. And then how could you actually use the breath as a navigation tool? So if things are starting to come up, how could you amplify the breath to maybe amplify your experience? Or if things are completely overwhelming, how could you use the breath to then slow down? Because I mean, realistically, that's what I'm doing in a breathwork session. Once I get to this experience, I'm then using my breath to then navigate through whatever's coming up. So if something is really intense that's coming up, I'm like, I want to make this bigger. I want to get this out of my system. I want to go into this. I might start breathing into that space, amplifying it, and really getting it up front and personal with it. And then other times I'm like, you know what? Like maybe I need to slow down in my breathing. And that really translates to psychedelic experiences. I think like when you're in it, how could you really use the breath? Because these are just all tools to get there. So, like I got really turned on to breath work because I had a very similar experience to some of my early psychedelic experiences and a near-death experience that I had. And I was just blown away. I went into it very skeptical of thinking, this isn't going to do anything. Like I've had all these really powerful experiences. I don't think it's going to be on par with any of this. And it was all those experiences wrapped up in one. And then our breathwork teacher, Lenny, was really convinced when he was doing a session, I think he was doing a session with Stan Groff, and he was saying, Stan, like this session was really on par with some of my most powerful LSD experiences. And Stan responded, that's what turned me onto this as well. Just having very similar experiences. So
it's worth doing. It's worth giving another try.
It's been my main vehicle since 2003. I started reading about it in 2001. It's been very helpful for me, for sure.
Well, and there may be a good obstacle is the way version of this for me, because as I was just saying, the issue I had with breath work is it feels hijacked by my ego in like I'm trying to force it. And so maybe that very dynamic is the doorway that it would be worth using it for in this moment. Like that's the invitation. So like do the breath work, come to that place, and then see what happens if I stay with that place without, well, I don't know. I have to wait and see what I do there, but like to stay with the edge and then see what happens there. I think that could be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like I've definitely had those experiences where I'm like in my head, I'm thinking about what I'm going to draw on the mandala afterwards. I'm like, oh, like my ego definitely hijacks it. And it is the practice to how can I surrender into this? There is this we call it breath work because it takes a lot of conscious energy to keep breathing. So, you kind of are online. But, in a couple of my last sessions, I finally said, what happens when I completely let go and let my body do whatever the hell it wants to do? I'm going to let my voice do whatever it does and really just let go. And that was really scary to just let my body just move in really odd ways and start screaming and start vocalizing things and just really kind of surrendering into that experience. And it really took a lot of effort to pull the ego back. But, it's also a really interesting experience in surrender, which it sounds like, you mentioned that beforehand that you have difficulty surrendering. So it'd be an interesting edge to explore, right? Like we might explore psychedelics because it really dampens that response. It's like, oh, I can surrender into it a little bit easier. But like, how could you translate that into like normal life when you have something like breath work where it's like maybe a little bit harder to do that and really trying to test those edges?
I like that. And maybe even some kind of partnered breath work in terms of intimacy. Yeah. Maybe there's a way to kind of create that surrender in that space of connectedness. So that's cool. That's a good suggestion.
Yeah. So I noticed we're at an hour. I feel like I've been chatting with you for like 10 minutes. I feel like we've barely touched the surface on a lot of stuff. So I definitely want to just highlight Maya and what you guys are doing over there. And I know we can just touch on it briefly and then just let people know what's up with it. And because it sounds like an exciting new platform for clinicians and therapists in the psychedelic space.
Yeah. So I've been wanting a community building role in the psychedelic space for a while. So for Fest 300, I was the creative director. And essentially my job was I would go to festivals around the world, make friends with people, give talks, write articles, hire people to be freelancers. And I was basically nurturing this ecosystem around the world through festival culture, connecting people to each other, helping people out in different ways. And as I get older, I still love festivals, but I don't want to schlep myself around to festival after festival. And I'm really interested in human blossoming. And at first it was through festivals as these incubators. And now, increasingly ceremony, retreat, and psychedelic therapy. And so I was looking at where do I want to be? Who do I want to support? And my friend David Champion, who I've known for a long time, we went to Africa Burn together. We've had a lot of experiences together, was launching a nonprofit called Unlimited Sciences. And this is a nonprofit for psychedelic measurement. So sort of big data crunching on psychedelic experiences. And I actually gave him some feedback about that early in when it started. And I thought it was just this really interesting project. And then I was kind of looking around for a community building role in the psychedelic space. And it wasn't, Unlimited Sciences wasn't the right fit at that time. And do you know Liana from MAPS? Yeah.
Haven't had any connection, but no other. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the North Star Ethics Pledge that they've just come out with?
Yeah, we were just chatting about that earlier.
Great. Yeah. I'm actually having her on my show next week. So she'll be on Life as a Festival talking about psychedelic ethics. So Liana is someone who I've been talking to for like a year, basically being like, who should I go work for? Who's... Because ethics are so important in psychedelics right now because there's money to be made. And so people are going to come in and want to cut corners. And cutting corners when it comes to creating the safety for deep psychedelic trauma work could be disastrous. And the medicalization of psychedelics gone a certain direction could even potentially defang their transformative power in relation to society. Because what psychedelics treat is not just the individual patient, they actually treat the society by allowing us to move past our more limited egoic perspectives of, winner take all, small game kind of plan. They kind of help us break out of that, which helps us change society. So I'm very, very interested in working with people who are approaching business in the psychedelic space from a properly psychedelic collection of values and ethos. So I've been talking to Liana for a while about that. And I actually auditioned with a couple of different companies in the space. I talked to some different people. I just couldn't find the right fit. So David started a company called Maya. in addition to Unlimited Sciences. And what Maya is Maya is an intelligence platform for psychedelic therapists to manage their clients and their protocols. So essentially, in the psychedelic space, which has been mostly underground or in these traditional indigenous lineages, as we transition that into the space of a more modern medical model, there aren't really gold standard ways of screening patients, for example, or understanding counterindications of different kinds of medicines. This is all kind of coming together. And there's some resources online. Obviously, MAPS has done some great work. But what Maya has created and is iterating on and preparing for the marketplace is a platform that psychedelic therapists can use to manage their clients in a way that helps them excel at what they're doing. It helps them excel at the preparation, at the therapy itself, and at the integration piece. And it provides all the resources to do that. It does not supplant the therapist. It isn't an app that you use for integration, for example. And it's important that it's not that, because people need real people to heal. But this is all of the technological needs to support that healing. And it's for psychedelic therapists, for retreat leaders, for the whole psychedelic community working in a healing modality. This software is to serve them. And so, as I was saying, the ethical piece is so important to me. So I'm working now with a close friend, a longtime burner, someone who actually really gets it. And we, Maya, are signing on to the North Star Pledge. I'm actually helping write that copy this week, and then having Leon on my show to talk about it. And for me, I wanted to do community building in a deeply ethical, in a way that's grounded in the psychedelic ethics that are so important. And so the first step of building a community is to listen to existing communities, to understand what people want and need, and begin to understand who the leaders are. And I've known leaders in the psychedelic community, particularly those orthogonal to the festival community, for many years. But now it's about how do we understand who all these different voices are, what they have to say, how these existing communities are all meeting, and then find the way that we can serve them. And so I'm starting the community building component of my work with Maya through a podcast, because a podcast is something I know how to do well. It's low-hanging fruit in a certain way, and it allows Maya to define who we are while providing service for psychedelic therapists. Now, you were speaking about the educational component of your podcast, which I think actually dovetails pretty well with what we're trying to do. So, as I mentioned before we started recording, I would love to have both of you on the new podcast. And really, the goal here is to create a show, a weekly hour-long show, where leaders in the psychedelic movement can speak directly to psychedelic therapists, retreat leaders, shamans, and offer a perspective on the state of legalization, a perspective on contraindications, a perspective on equal access. So the podcast is called the Psychedelic Therapy Podcast. So it does what it says on the tin, right? You know, I was thinking, do we need like a fabulous artistic name? You know, I have Life as a Festival, and that's my project, and that's my fabulous Eamon Armstrong thing that I do. But that's not what this is. This is a podcast for psychedelic therapists, so that they can listen to the stories of people like them. They can be inspired by other practitioners. They can learn things that are valuable in an infotainment style, fun interview format. And we're actually launching it next week. So we are recording right now on April 29th. So we will be launching this, Maya will be launching this podcast, the Psychedelic Therapy Podcast, next week. So probably it will be live once this podcast goes live. And I'm really, really excited about it. I'm really proud of it. And I'm going to learn so much about what it needs to be as it rolls out. So one of the things that I do with Life as a Festival is I have a Facebook group where all the people who really love that podcast and want to talk about it are in that group, and they can, give me questions to ask my guests. There's a whole reciprocal relationship there. So with the Psychedelic Therapy Podcast, I'll be doing the same thing. And what I'm starting with right now, where I'm interviewing some really interesting people, for example, like Dr. David Rabin, who's both a psychiatrist and a PhD neuroscientist, or Tony Moss, who is an ayahuasca shaman and civic activist through ayahuasca, really interesting people. But what people are going to really want from that show, I will learn in a reciprocal way over time. And then that will actually inform the Maya product itself. So the people listening to this show and then in conversation around this show are people who we're actually building this product for: the retreat leaders, the therapists, the psychedelic enthusiasts who want to move into a more of a healing space with it. And so there'll be this reciprocal relationship through the lens of the podcast that then informs the software itself. So that's the move. That's the strategy. And I'm really excited to launch it next week and to see how it develops.
Sounds phenomenal. Seems like you're really hitting a need. Like, it's strange that it's taken till like 2017 is when I started hearing about big data kind of hitting psychedelics a little bit better. I was at, the Oakland conference and talking to one of the Eroids about how they went into the back end and were able to share some data with some scientists, and they were able to write like 5 to 7 papers from this data that took her 10 minutes to gather. And just a few hours before that, I met a engineer, Tim Cools, who developed psychedelicexperience.net to like kind of, you hear this in San Francisco all the time, the Yelp of psychedelic retreats. So like that kind of deal. And he wanted to take kind of a structured data approach to like, how can we learn more with all of the people doing this stuff underground, because it's illegal. And Eroids, like their data isn't structured super well. So like if somebody has that experience and does it willfully with some money behind it, you could really get some amazing findings. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, and it's cool because we're starting to work with different training programs as well. So giving these training programs the software for free as a way of understanding what they need and then adjusting Maya to that. And so I'm not sure where the agreement is with MAPS right now, so I can't speak to that. But are you familiar with the SAGE Institute?
I've heard of them. Yep.
Yeah. So SAGE is doing, equal access to psychedelic therapy. And they're also training psychedelic therapists from communities not typically represented in the psychedelic space. And so for them, they're operating on really tight budgets and they have tons of needs. They're using spreadsheets and Google Docs to manage, different aspects of the client journey. If we come in and we solve that for them for free, then we have this beautiful reciprocal relationship where we're supporting the training of new therapists in the space, which everybody needs because the need for these medicines is so vast. And then they're helping us understand, like, what is the product that we're making? Like, how is it exactly what they need? Like, why are we spending so much time on a feature that feels cool to us that when what they just want is just a really great space for synthesizing therapy notes? And again, I'm not like the product guy, I'm a community guy. So I don't know exactly what that'll ultimately look like. But, if we take psychedelics to understand that we are all one and to shed some of our limited, small, egoic perspectives of the world, then we should be approaching psychedelic business in that same way. Like, we are all one. We are all working together for the healing of not just individuals, but society. So we need to be in these collaborative, ethically structured configurations where MAPS is supporting SAGE, is supporting Maya, is supporting, psychedelics today. Like it's the ecosystem itself will thrive when we're all working in service to each other, which is, of course, how any ecosystem works, right?
Yeah, it needs to be a lot bigger than it is now, and it needs to be a lot more connected than it is now. Absolutely. There's so much happening, and it's hard to track. But once there's an ecosystem, we can feel a little bit more. Once there's a more mature ecosystem, maybe we'll put it that way. Like, there is an ecosystem, but like once it gets more mature, there's going to be a lot more richness for us in this field. And we get scared of big companies, but we have to realize that there's so much power at our level that it's really revolutionary. The small scale is powerful.
Well, and there's a part of the North Star approach, as I understand it, is that you need attractors to best practices from an ethical perspective. So basically, if it is a rainbow gold rush, right, and different people are entering the space to extract as much as they can from it, which is invariably going to happen, we must, those of us who are passionate about psychedelics being held in a certain kind of integrity, we must create systems that attract in so that basically you want to be part of the cool kids, and the cool kids are doing it ethically. So therefore you have to do it ethically. And if you cut corners in a way that violates the ethics of the community, you're shunned in such a way that that the value prop of doing it that way means that even companies who have no touch points to the festival community, have no idea this long tradition from indigenous lineages through these incredible psychedelic researchers today. They might not understand that, but they're like, okay, well, we have to play with the people who are in the most sort of robust, blossoming place in psychedelic medicine. And those have all signed this ethics pledge. Those are all operating with a certain level of integrity. So I have to operate under that level of integrity to be part of it. And I think it's incumbent upon us, especially those in psychedelic culture, in a sort of smaller, more underground, more counterculture kind of way. It's incumbent upon us to create those attractors and really create this really vivid, vibrant, alive ecosystem where you'd be an idiot to half-ass your way through when you could just come and join us and make everybody happier.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's a great way to get ahead of these problems and build the future we want to build, and definitely appreciate that.
Well, and just to give an important shout out, the first person who put that particular bug in my ear was Jamie Wheel. And, he's done a great job sounding the alarm around issues with medicalization of psychedelics out of his book, Stealing Fire, and the work that he's done since then. And the framing that I just gave originally came from an idea from Jamie. And I'm sure he's not the only person who have thought of that, but this idea that we need these powerful attractors to bring everybody who wants to participate with psychedelics, to bring them into this space of integrity. It's so, so important.
Yeah, I definitely think so.
I'm glad to hear that. I haven't really been keeping up with Jamie and what he's been up to. I love the book. I love what he's up to generally, but I should stay more in tune with what he's up to, because I just really loved his work.
Well, there's a great episode of Life is a Festival with Jamie Wheel. And if you want to check it out.
You got Jamie Wheel on your podcast? No, I'm in. That's cool.
Yeah. Well, basically I just gave him like 2 hours to talk shit about immature Burning Man perspectives. Not Burning Man generally. Like, he's a big fan of Burners Without Borders, but he's got a great way of describing, he was talking about the spiritual cul-de-sac of Burning Man, where, you think you're enlightened, you're like almost to the Golden Gates, but really you're stuck in Hotel California. And he's got a very poetic way of talking shit.
I'll check that episode out.
It's important. Like, we've got to shed some light on this stuff, and it's sometimes very uncomfortable to put ourselves out there critiquing people that we love at times.
Well, and I can circle this back to one of the core threads of this conversation, which is around rite of passage and responsible participation in community. And so in the rite of passage piece, I have been really passionate about the hero's journey arc, and a certain understanding of the hero's journey arc that came to me through this work, which is in The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Joseph Campbell talks about the initiation, the space of initiation. And there's a quote from that book where I wish I had it totally memorized, but essentially what he says is, we needn't fear the maze ahead because the heroes of all time have walked before us. And where we had thought that we would find a demon, we will find a god. Where we had thought that we would slay a dragon, we will slay ourselves. And where we had thought we would be alone, we are one with all the world. And what I love about this idea of the hero's journey is that the dragon that you are supposed to slay in the peak of your initiatory experience, in the peak of your rite of passage, your hero's journey, that dragon exists inside you. It's not an external dragon. It is actually the childish boy psychology that is fine. It's not a bad thing. But to cross over that threshold into maturity, something has to die, and you have to slay it. And it's your heroic preoccupation with self. Like, I am the hero. I am going to slay the dragon. I am going to triumph in the proper liminal space of an initiation into being a cohesive member of a community is slaying yourself. And I think when we look at Burning Man and we look at the psychedelic world, we all need to get together as a community to support the integrity of psychedelics in this moment. We don't want to go the Timothy Leary way. Timothy Leary was very much the personal hero. He was the acid messiah. He was very preoccupied with his own cult. And there was a way in which that approach to psychedelics really fucked the movement at that time. Obviously, there were a lot of other things going on, and you can't just pin it all on poor Timothy Leary. But if you contrast that with the more community focused directions that they went with psychedelics, where they were humble members of a bigger community, like Ram Dass or Stanislav Grof, where it wasn't the same, I'm the hero, it's about me kind of thing. And so what Jamie is leveling at the Burning Man community, and what I think we can see in psychedelics generally, is that we all need to kind of get over ourselves and not try to be the hero of the psychedelic renaissance, and instead see what roles we all need to play to help raise this barn together as a village.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, there's something there with people who want to be the monopoly, and some of them are really transparent about wanting to be that dominant figure. I think there's something there, and we got to really consider that. Like, are we trying to be George Clooney of psychedelics, or are we trying to be, a part of an ecosystem, like really contribute to the whole, and to others. Yeah. Yeah. Like Grof would always say, like, the most important and beautiful thing here is the human soul and how rich that thing is. And nothing really special about him other than he had an incredible story and he had an incredible mind, but doesn't mean that anybody else is, more or less beautiful than that person. So,
well,
yeah.
Well, and it makes me think about, that initiation in Gabon, where all of the members of the community had these exquisite costumes. And at the same time, there was this profound pageantry in this ancient ritual where these different members of this community all had their roles to play, and all had their little twirls and the dips and the movements and the dance and the whole thing. And yet at the same time, they were all wearing these extremely exquisite, sparkly, colorful, like really incredible costumes that each individually represented who they were and allowed them to shine. So it's not that we can't shine as who we are. Like, y'all have this great podcast, and this is this shining creative thing that you've made, and it's beautiful. But it's just that we can't hijack this blossoming for everyone by trying to be the lone hero of it ourselves.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play, and we all get to shine brightly in our individual expression of the divine in that role. But it's not anybody's place to say, well, I am the Bufo man, and I shall have all of the Bufo and all of the women and the Bufo, and I will grant you the 5-MeO speed dating with God, but only if you give the proper penance to my ego. We gotta avoid that.
Right, yeah, let me tase you and whatnot and waterboard you. Yeah. So there's some gnarly stuff there, and there's some amazing opportunities. And how do we become aware of it so that we can avoid making these same mistakes in the future? A lot of questions to ask ourselves and a lot to learn. Like, just because you have access to the drug and a lot of experience with the drug doesn't make you that person. Learn more about what's happening and in your ecosystem before you really go hard at it.
Well, and that's part of why, it's such a shame that we don't have initiations into psychedelic experiences as the Bwiti do, or as they, as I'm sure, although I have not sat with anyone in the Amazon around ayahuasca, whether there are initiations into that. But if you just have a medicine cabinet full of, the ultimate connection with God, and you have no idea how to scaffold your way up to that, no idea how to integrate it, it's very easy to have a vision, surmise that vision is absolute reality, and then move into some kind of manic prosthetializing space of like, but don't you know about the 1,000-headed turtle? The 1,000-headed turtle, and I see, we make, it's such a plague, I think, in psychedelic cultures that people are desperate for something to worship that they see in their visions, and there isn't the right kind of community holding of that. There isn't the right kind of, as I said, scaffolding up to it. And so, and I'm not saying that I've done, I've had my journeys of seeing the 1,000-headed turtle and thinking that I am the only one who knows its splendor, but you don't get very far with that.
Yeah. Kyle, anything you want to maybe close with? We're at about an hour and a half. I would love to go for another hour if we could, but
this has been really fun. And I feel like I could just riff on the Rites of Passage thing for a while. It's been a huge focus of mine in the past few years. And I was talking about this with our teacher, Lenny, about like cosmology and Rites of Passages, and just like thinking about like psychedelics as initiation, and thinking, going back to like the Eleusinian mysteries or something like, this Bwiti initiation, where you have this cosmology where you're getting initiated into, and that's like your worldview. As of right now, it's like open to like, oh, I'm having these experiences and I'm making sense of it myself. Like sometimes there's no lineage where we're at now. And I feel like kind of makes us like all over the board at times, instead of being like, here's like, what we're understanding, what our values are, and kind of getting more initiated into that. And it makes me even wonder, like with this North Star pledge and, some of like the elders in the psychedelic community, and thinking about like, Joe and I actually just recorded a podcast before we jumped on with you, and we were talking a lot about like the corporate side of things, and people coming in and maybe not understanding those psychedelic values. Makes me wonder if they've been through kind of their own psychedelic initiation, their own rites, to kind of understand that space. Whereas like some of the people that have been around for a while, that have been able to embody some of these insights, these values, and these ways of being, they're the ones shaping these other institutions and organizations. Whereas some of these new players are coming in, they're just like, oh, okay, here we are. And there is kind of no like rite or initiation in there. And so, it'll be interesting to see. And I like that idea of like the attractor, and how could we create that, I don't know, maybe narrative to hold a little bit of integrity and ethics as this thing starts to take form.
I love a podcast where you get to the end and you can see how a theme has been dancing its way through the whole conversation that you never would have been able to plan and prepare for. So I had no idea that you were digging these initiations and rites of passage, because it's been a huge focus of mine. And isn't it interesting, on this particular conversation, we spoke about the Bwiti experience as an initiation. And then at the same time, we're looking at the psychedelic community broadly and wondering, who is initiated, and why is it necessary that people are initiated such that they can do business with the psychedelic community? Because I think what it comes down to is this: psychedelics as medicine treat societies beyond individuals. And it's not just that the neurochemistry in your brain is that the serotonin 2A receptor responds to ketamine, and that makes your depression go away for a couple of weeks. I mean, there's that aspect to things. But what's more profound is you have a psychedelic experience, you start meditating, you start eating more vegetables, and then you start thinking, okay, well, why don't I have some land here by my house. Why I should grow some vegetables here too, so I can eat the vegetables that I'm growing. And there's a way in which it is transforming lifestyle that then transforms society. And I think if you approach psychedelics with the mindset of extractive capitalism, which is killing the earth, then there needs to be some prophylactic that protects the golden goose from those kinds of sticky fingers, if some kind of initiatory space. Like, I don't want to do business with anyone in the psychedelic space who has not had a difficult psychedelic experience. Not just who hasn't had a psychedelic experience. I want to do business with someone who has sat for an eternity in the desolate wasteland of their own soul and had to come to terms with their smallness and the magnitude of the universe, and then wants to build a company that's of service to others and that benefits everybody, rather than someone who's like, let's do it. We're going to make all this money. It's just it's the wrong fit. So to me, that's what psychedelic ethics are about. And that includes, honoring these ancestral lineages. It includes, Iboga is the Iboga plant is getting decimated by people wanting to use Iboga. And then the people who are keeping, the bufo toad or the Iboga plant or whatever, these are marginalized people too. So what is the integrity of our relationship to the earth through the psychedelic lens? Like, that's what we should be going for as a community, not how do we make the most money healing veterans. Yes, we should heal veterans, but let's also heal the sickness in us that sends us to so much war, and let psychedelics be part of that.
Totally. Yeah. I love it. Maybe this is a good place to wrap. I feel like we could just keep riffing. And I do kind of like that theme. I mean, I wasn't expecting to talk about rites of passages, and it just naturally seemed to come up. And yeah, it's been an interesting journey with you, Eamon, and really appreciate it. So anything that you want to pitch, or where can people find you to close this out?
Yeah. So my podcast is called Life is a Festival. And if you're interested in a little bit more about my Iboga experience, I have an early episode is called Find Your Rite of Passage, which is about my Iboga experience. I also talked about it on the Plant Medicine podcast. But if you're interested in festival culture, psychedelics, living a fabulous life, Life is a Festival is my project that's really the expression of me and what I care about and my sort of Eamon Armstrong shining adventure thing. And then the new podcast that I'm launching with Maya is called the Psychedelic Therapy Podcast, which is for psychedelic healers, retreat leaders, and also for enthusiasts around psychedelic medicine specifically. And I would love for whoever's listening to check that out. And as we roll it out, I'm so excited for the feedback, for what the community is thinking about, what they want. I'd love to hear where where it's a misstep, what people love. So I'm really interested in how that lands. So if people are listening at the moment and are really interested, as I am, in this conversation around ethics and around what the psychedelic community can be, I would love your feedback on the new podcast that I'm producing with Maya. Oh, and Maya is mayahealth.com.
MAYA.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
MAYA, yes.
Tight. All right. Eamon, really appreciate you joining us. And I hope we can do this again. This is really fun. And if you're ever in Colorado, hit me up. Love to record in person too.
Yeah, I usually only record in person. So this quarantine's been a bit of a struggle for me for that. But Maya's actually based in Denver. And so once we start moving again, I'll be spending some time in Colorado.
Great.
I'd love to chat more. And I'd love to have y'all on the new Psychedelic Therapy podcast. And we can talk about the work that you're going to be doing in educating and kind of pulling information from your show to support practitioners. I think there's a great synergy there. So let's get together.
Definitely.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Eamon. Until next time.
Thanks so much, guys.
And there you have it. Eamon Armstrong from Life is a Festival podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode. We definitely did. I really wanted to talk to him for a number more hours, but we'll have to hold until he's in Colorado. We can do one in person. So again, check out our course, Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists, up at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. A lot of great stuff there. And I think you will like it if you're planning to help support people through psychedelic experiences, or you're interested in becoming a facilitator in the future. This is a amazing way to get prepared for this coming wave of psychedelic use and, well, the existing wave too. There's plenty happening right now. I know a number of therapists who are almost getting too full because they offer psychedelic integration work, and perhaps that's the most interesting work there is. I don't know. I'm not a therapist, but if you're interested in doing this kind of work, why not get prepared? And we can help. psychedeliceducationcenter.com. Class starts July 9, and it's called Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. I think that's it for this. So we will see you on the next episode, and really hope you enjoyed it. This is Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today. Bye-bye.